The first time I saw those numbers, the bark around them was already starting to swell shut. They were cut low on the trunk of a pine, the grooves pale and raw against dark, weathered wood, like someone had pressed a knife in again and again until their hand began to tremble. Behind the tree, the ravine dropped away into shadow, the air colder down there still and damp, carrying the faint smell of wet stone and old needles. The light was strange that day, thin and silvery, and the wind moved high in the branches, but not down where we stood like the hill itself was holding its breath. Up close, you could see how the knife had slipped once, leaving a crooked scratch beside the last digit, almost like a stutter in the message. One of the deputies shifted his boots on the damp ground, clearing his throat, but nobody spoke. Not at first. Somewhere far off, a jay screamed and went quiet, and all I could hear was my own heartbeat in my ears and the faint scrape of my thumb over the rough edge of the bark. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from, and follow if you believe some names should never fade. My name is Michael, and before any of that happened, before coordinates and search maps and evidence bags under fluorescent lights, I was just the uncle who always said yes when my niece wanted to talk about mountains. Back then, my world was a small one, a red brick high school at the edge of town, a classroom that smelled like dry erase markers and old books, and a little gray house on a tree-lined street in Cedar Ridge, Iowa. Most mornings in that summer of 2010, I woke up to the soft whir of the box fan in my bedroom window and the sound of a freight train moving slowly along the river, its low rumble rolling across the cornfields before the heat set in. The sun came up early and sharp, turning the dew on the grass in my front yard into a thin silver film that soaked your shoes if you went out for the paper too soon. You could smell cut grass and hot asphalt by 9 in the morning, and by noon, the air over Main Street shimmered above the blacktop like a mirage. Cedar Ridge is the kind of place where time doesn't seem in a hurry. Those July days settled in around us like warm bathwater cicadas whining in the trees by late afternoon screen doors banging as kids ran in and out, the smell of charcoal drifting from somebody's backyard grill. Most evenings I sat on my front porch with a glass of iced tea sweating on the railing, listening to tires crunch over gravel as my neighbors' cars rolled slowly down the alley behind the houses. A dog 2 doors down liked to bark at nothing in particular, then give up with a heavy sigh and flop onto the cool patch of dirt under its owner's maple tree. You could hear lawn sprinklers ticking rhythmically, casting their thin arcs of water across small rectangles of grass, and the distant hum of a combine if the wind was right. That summer, Rachel's name showed up on my phone more than anyone else's. She was halfway through a master's program in geography, and she'd taken a summer placement in Denver, working with a team that studied urban planning and open space. She'd grown up on the same streets I had, walking the same cracked sidewalks to the same brick school, but her eyes had always been turned outward toward maps and ridgelines, and places our little town would never touch. Even when she was a kid, she'd sit at my kitchen table with an atlas open tracing rivers with one finger, while we ate grilled cheese and listened to the rain rattle gently against the window panes. By 27, she'd hiked in 6 states, spent a winter break in the Smokies, and saved every spare dollar for boots and gear instead of new clothes. Her backpack, she used to joke, was her real apartment. Everything important fit inside it. Over the phone that June, I could hear the difference in her voice when she talked about Colorado. There was a lightness there, even through the static, like the air was thinner on her end of the line, and she was breathing more easily. She'd call from her small rented room in Denver. You could hear traffic through the open window, the occasional siren, the soft hiss of a bus's brakes on a nearby street. While I sat at my kitchen table in Iowa with the ceiling fan humming overhead and the smell of coffee drifting up from the mug in front of me. She'd describe how the mountains looked just before sunset, purple and blue against the western sky, snow still clinging in streaks to the high peaks. "Uncle Mike," she'd say, her voice low and almost reverent. "They're right there. I can see them from the bus stop." I'd close my eyes and picture it the jagged horizon beyond a city of glass and concrete, the evening light slanting through the smog and dust, catching on the windows of tall buildings. Rachel and I shared something my sister and her husband didn't quite understand. We both liked edges. Not the wild kind, not cliffs without ropes or storms chased for the thrill, but that quiet feeling of standing where one kind of world gives way to another. For me, it was history-old battlefields and faded courthouse records, the smell of brittle paper when you opened a file that hadn't seen daylight in years. For her, it was ridgelines and tree lines, the place where pine gave way to rock and sky, where a footstep could still feel like a discovery. Her parents worried, of course. John was a practical man, the kind who liked predictable commutes and bills paid early, and Carol had seen enough in her years as a nurse to know how fast an ordinary day could turn. But Rachel was careful in a way that gave them comfort-detailed itineraries, laminated maps, extra batteries, layers of clothing rolled tight in the bottom of her pack. The last time I saw her in person before that summer, it was early May. She'd driven home from Des Moines in her aging sedan, the one that made a soft, rattling sound when you hit 40 on the highway, just to have Sunday dinner and talk about her plans. We sat around my sister's oak dining table, the house smelling like pot roast and garlic, and the faint lemon of the cleaner she used on the countertops. Rachel kept pulling folded papers from her messenger bag, spreading them out on the table between our plates, printouts of trail descriptions, elevation profiles, weather averages for July in the Front Range. She tapped the page with a short, clean fingernail. Little tan lines still visible where a ring had been when she was younger and went through a phase of collecting costume jewelry. This one, she said, pointing to a moderately rated trail that traced a long valley before climbing past timberline. This will probably be my last big hike before I come back home in August. The way she said it, calm, matter-of-fact, like she'd already walked it in her head, settled over the room like a soft blanket. I remember the light in the kitchen that evening more clearly than the exact words we said. The sun was low, sliding in through the west-facing window and catching dust motes in its beam, making them swirl lazily above the tabletop like tiny, slow-moving constellations. The ceiling fan turned overhead with its familiar soft thump on one slightly warped blade, pushing warm air around, stirring the scent of meat and onions, and the faint perfume my sister always wore on Sundays. In the living room, the television was muted, flashing images of a baseball game we weren't really watching. The air outside the screen door was thick with humidity, and the sound of kids on bicycles laughing as they coasted down the slight hill on Oak Street. It was all so ordinary that it felt indestructible, like a picture you could step in and out of whenever you wanted. If there were early cracks in that picture, I didn't see them for what they were. I remember now how John's fork paused just above his plate when she mentioned hiking alone, how his jaw flexed once before he forced a smile and nodded. I remember how Carol's hands moved a little faster than usual when she cleared the dishes, plates clinking against one another with a faint, uneven rhythm in the sink. There was a moment when Rachel went out to the driveway to grab something from her car, and the three of us left inside traded one of those quiet looks families share, half worry, half resignation. Outside, we could hear the creak of her trunk lid opening, a faint metallic groan in the warm evening air, then the soft thud as she closed it. Sprinklers clicked on in a neighbor's yard, the water whispering against their siding and the sweet, damp smell of wet grass drifting in through the screen. A week later, after she'd driven back to Des Moines to finish up her semester and then flown west, her calls came less often but longer. She was working full days at the office in Denver, taking notes in meetings, running small errands for the project leads, stealing glances at the mountains through glass whenever she could. On the phone, I could hear the muffled hum of office chatter behind her, the occasional ring of a distant telephone, and over that the excitement she was trying and failing to keep modest. She told me about the heat bouncing off the downtown sidewalks, the way thunderstorms built up fast over the foothills in the afternoons, piling up in dark stacks that spat lightning before they dragged curtains of rain across the city. At my end, I'd lean against my kitchen counter with the windows open, listening to the soft churn of the river a few blocks away and the buzz of insects in the trees, imagining those same storms rolling off the Front Range. Rachel had a little ritual that summer, one I didn't think much of at the time. Every night, usually sometime between 10 and 11, she'd send out a short message to a small group of us, me, her parents, a close friend from college. Just a few lines where she'd been that day, how she was feeling sometimes, a grainy cell phone picture of a sunset from her bus stop or a coffee cup on her desk with a mountain ridge blurred in the background. You could practically hear her smile in the way she typed the stray exclamation point tucked into otherwise careful sentences. It became background noise in our lives, a soft little ping from our phones, just as the weather forecast finished on the local news, or as we turned off the kitchen light and checked the deadbolt on the back door. I'd be brushing my teeth, the cool mint taste sharp in my mouth, and hear my phone buzz on the nightstand, knowing without looking that it was her. In early July, she called to tell me she'd finally picked the day for that last big hike. I was sitting on my back steps when the phone rang, the wood warm under my legs, the smell of my neighbor's charcoal grill drifting over the fence along with the faint sizzle of something cooking. Fireflies were just starting to blink in the shadows under the hedge, tiny green pinpricks in the heavy dusk. She sounded tired, but happy. Her voice a little hoarse from a long week, but still bright when she described the route, a popular trail, well-marked, plenty of traffic, nothing out of her comfort zone. She made a joke about how she'd probably be passed by retirees with trekking poles and better knees, and I laughed, imagining her waving people around her with that easy, lopsided grin. At some point, without thinking much, I said, "Text me when you start all right and when you're back down. Just humor your old uncle." She snorted softly in my ear, then agreed. The night before her hike, I sat at my kitchen table with the windows open, grading a few stray papers I'd brought home even though classes were long out for the summer. The overhead light buzzed faintly, moths tapping at the glass shade, and outside I could hear the distant murmur of the highway and the steady chorus of crickets in the grass. My phone buzzed once, skittering slightly against the wood of the tabletop, a message from Rachel. She'd sent a blurry picture of her rented car in a Denver parking lot headlights, reflecting off the asphalt in the evening light, plus a line or two about getting up early, about wanting to remember these mountains for a long time. I typed back something teasing and fatherly, told her to double-check the weather and to pack more water than she thought she needed. The air through the screens was warm and smelled faintly of river mud and someone's laundry detergent drifting from a nearby dryer vent. The next morning, July 11th, dawn came up over Cedar Ridge in that soft, washed-out way it does when the day is going to be hot. Thin light seeped through my bedroom blinds, and the room was already stuffy when I sat up the cotton sheets twisted around my ankles. I padded into the kitchen, the linoleum cool under my bare feet, and made coffee while the old radio on the counter muttered through the farm report and then the national news. At some point after 8, my phone chimed with a short message from Denver. Rachel telling me she was headed for the trailhead, that the sky was clear, that she'd see me on the other side of the day. I could almost see her in my mind, hat pulled low against the sun. Backpack strapped snug over her shoulders, boots scuffing on the gravel of some mountain parking lot. I sent back a thumbs up I knew she'd roll her eyes at, finished my coffee and stepped out onto the front porch, blinking into the brightness of a Midwestern morning, already humming with insect noise. The day wore on in its usual slow way. I mowed the front yard, feeling the sun press down on the back of my neck, the smell of cut grass thick in the air and clinging to my shoes. I drove to the hardware store for a new air filter and stood in the faintly dusty coolness of the aisle while the overhead lights buzzed and an old country song crackled from the ceiling speakers. At home again, I ate a late lunch standing at the counter, the refrigerator door open longer than it should have been as I stared at leftovers and settled on cold chicken and a slice of cheese. Nothing about that Sunday felt sharp or strange. It was all small errands and familiar noises, the kind of day that slides past without leaving much of a mark. It wasn't until late that evening, when the local weather had come and gone on the 10 o'clock news, and the house had gone quiet around me, that something felt just a little off. I was sitting in my worn armchair, the fabric rough under my bare forearms, a floor lamp casting a warm yellow circle over the pages of a paperback I wasn't really reading. Outside, the night air pressed against the windows, warm and a little sticky, and the sound of crickets was loud enough that I could hear them through the glass. I glanced over at the small rectangle of my phone on the coffee table, dark silent, and realized I hadn't heard its soft buzz all evening. Her nightly message hadn't come. I told myself she was just tired, that mountain air and miles of trail would do that to a person, and that she'd probably fallen asleep with her phone on the nightstand screen down the way she sometimes did back home. Still, when I got up to turn off the porch light, I hesitated for a moment with my hand on the switch, staring out through the thin curtain at the quiet street, the sodium street lamp painting the pavement a dull amber, and the branches above it barely moving in the heavy air. For the first time that summer, the silence from her felt just a shade heavier than it should have, like a pause in a sentence that went on a beat too long. I didn't go to bed right away that night. Some part of me kept thinking that if I stayed awake just a little longer, if I kept the house warm with lights and quiet movement, her message would come through like it always did. I sat in my armchair with the lamp glowing low beside me, turning the same page of my book over and over without really seeing it. Outside, the crickets carried on their endless chorus, a long, steady hum that should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like a blanket pulled too tight across my chest. Around 11, I picked up my phone and turned it over in my hand. The cool weight of it made the room feel colder. I told myself she'd had a long day, that mountain air could knock anyone out early, that maybe her phone battery had slipped lower than she expected. I even thumbed out a joking text. "Still alive out there, kiddo," but erased it before sending. It felt wrong somehow, like tapping on a closed door in a dark hallway. By midnight, the house had gone still. The refrigerator clicked once, then settled. A light breeze pressed against the window screens, carrying the smell of the river and something faintly metallic like distant rain. I finally gave up and went to bed, leaving my phone on the nightstand with the volume turned high. I woke up just after 5 with the sun still low and fog clinging to the trees behind my house. The first thing I did was reach for the phone. No messages, no missed calls, just a blank, quiet screen. The air in the bedroom felt heavy, stale, like the space between two breaths held too long. I tried to shake it off, splashed cold water on my face, made coffee, walked barefoot across the creaking floorboards to turn on the local news. Steam curled from the mug in my hands, warm against my palms, but it didn't settle the unease that had been growing since the night before. I found myself checking the clock more than usual, glancing at the phone each time I passed the counter. By mid-morning, the Iowa heat was already settling in. Cicadas had started their slow rise in the trees, a distant trembling drone. I stood at the kitchen window with the curtain pushed aside, staring at the phone on the table as if I could force it to light up. It didn't. Around 10, I called her mother. Carol answered on the second ring, her voice a little sleep-rough but steady. "She didn't check in last night," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Probably just tired." There was a soft pause on the other end, the kind of silence that has shape and weight. "She didn't message us either," Carol whispered. I heard the faint rustle of her robe sleeve brushing the receiver and the low hum of their refrigerator in the background. "She always messages." We traded reassurances like two people placing sandbags against a rising river. Long day, spotty service in the mountains, battery dead, overslept. In the moment, each explanation felt like a plank we could cling to, but underneath it all, ran a thin, cold current neither of us dared to acknowledge. By early afternoon, Colorado was still waking up. Her father tried calling her, then calling again. Each time his voice sounded more clipped, more controlled, as if holding himself steady took effort. When her phone rang twice and went straight to voicemail, the air around me seemed to tighten. I pictured her little rented room in Denver sunlight pushing faint stripes across the carpet, her backpack on the floor by the bed. I pictured the phone sitting on the nightstand, dark and unmoved. No one said the word missing out loud, not yet. But fear can take shape long before a word is spoken. Around noon, the car rental company called the Bennetts. She hadn't returned her vehicle that morning. That was the first moment something in me went cold. Rachel was punctual to a fault. If she said she'd return a car at 10 a.m., she meant exactly 10 a.m., not 5, after, not 20, after, not whenever the morning allowed. The Bennetts reached out to the Swedish embassy. Her original plans had been international before she came back home, and within an hour, the embassy had contacted the local police in Denver. The shift from family concern to official involvement was like stepping from warm water into ice. Once law enforcement enters a picture even gently, you realize how thin your reassurances were. I paced my house while waiting for updates. The floorboards popped under my feet as the heat rose and the faint smell of sunlight on old wood filled the living room. Every time the phone buzzed, my breath caught only for it to be junk mail, a weather alert, or a neighbor misunderstanding the group chat. I kept glancing at the clock, listening to the hollow tick of the kitchen wall clock each second, stretching longer than the one before. Around mid-afternoon, a call came from Colorado. They'd located the rental car. My heart thudded so loud I could hear it in my ears. The officer on the line explained that the car had been found at a small trailhead tucked neatly into a gravel lot, windows intact, doors locked. Nothing inside showed signs of panic or abandonment. Just empty water bottles, a few wrappers, a road atlas on the passenger seat. No keys, no phone, no Rachel. The officer spoke carefully, as though choosing each word was like selecting a delicate object from a shelf. "It just looks like she parked and went hiking," he said. "No sign of trouble." I thanked him because I didn't know what else to do. But when I hung up, the stillness of the room felt wrong, the dust floating in the sunlight like tiny drifting flecks of ash. I called Carol. She answered on the first ring, breath shaky like she'd run to the phone. I told her what I'd heard. She didn't cry, not then. She just drew in a sharp breath, then another, as if she were trying to steady herself on an invisible rail. She would have checked in, she said softly. No matter what happened up there, she would have let us know she was okay. Her father was already booking a flight before we ended the call. I remember stepping outside after that, needing air. The sun was too bright, washing the street in a glare that hurt my eyes. A neighbor across the way was watering his lawn, the stream from the hose arcing across the grass with a soft hiss. The smell of wet earth drifted toward me, warm and muddy. It all felt wrong, too, normal, too steady, like the world was moving forward while we were stuck in a moment that hadn't decided what it was yet. Through the afternoon, more calls came. Hikers who'd seen a red-haired woman the day before. A ranger confirming her name in the trail register. Another ranger noting the storm that had moved in late that afternoon, the kind that rattles the sky and leaves the air smelling of ozone. Each piece of information was small, simple, harmless on its own, but stacked together they began to outline a shape none of us wanted to see. I remember the moment the fear settled into something heavier. It was nearly 4 in the afternoon back in Iowa, the sun slanting long across my lawn, the locusts beginning their evening buzz. I was sitting on the porch steps, the warm wood pressing through my jeans, when the phone rang again. A deputy from Colorado. He was kind, steady-voiced, but there was something in the way he said my name that made the hairs rise on the back of my neck. "We don't have anything conclusive yet," he said. "But given the time that's passed, we're concerned." Concerned. It was the gentlest word for the sharpest drop I'd felt in years. He asked questions. Had she mentioned meeting anyone? Had she talked about changing her plans? Had she ever missed check-ins before I answered each one carefully, hearing the deputy's pen scratch softly across paper, the faint echo of office chatter in the background? When the call ended, I just sat there staring at the sidewalk where a few brown leaves from my maple had blown early in the heat. Sometime around 6, the Bennetts called again. They were already at the airport, the overhead announcements echoing through the line, their voices strained but controlled. They were heading to Denver. They didn't ask me to come. They didn't have to. I packed an overnight bag without thinking, folding shirts mechanically, the fabric soft and familiar under my hands. Before I walked out to my car, I stood for a moment in my living room, looking around as if trying to memorize the space. The lamp in the corner cast a warm, round glow on the hardwood floor. The house smelled faintly of coffee and the lemon oil I'd used on the furniture the week before. Everything looked exactly as it always had, and yet somehow the air itself seemed different, charged with an unease that hadn't been there the day before. As I stepped onto the porch, locking the door behind me, a sheriff's cruiser rolled slowly down the street tires, whispering over the pavement. I didn't think much of it until it slowed brake lights brightening in the dusk. The cruiser pulled gently to the curb in front of my house. The deputy inside opened the door, stepped out into the warm evening air, and took off his hat before speaking. That was the moment a simple silence became a real fear, and the night began to close in. I remember the way the deputy's radio crackled as he stepped toward me on the porch, the static drifting into the warm Iowa evening like a sound from another world. He didn't speak right away. He just held his hat loosely in one hand, looking at me through that quiet, apologetic expression law enforcement uses when they're about to deliver something heavy. Behind him, the cruiser's engine idled with a low, steady hum, headlights brushing the bottoms of the maple trees across the street. That was the moment I understood this wasn't just a late check-in or a dead phone battery. We had moved past family worry into something more formal, something with paperwork and protocols and people who didn't know my niece, but were now invested in finding her. By the time I reached Denver the next afternoon, the foothills were hazed with summer heat. The sky washed pale blue, except for a few clouds building toward the west. The airport smelled of hot pretzels and jet fuel, and my shoes clicked hollowly on the polished floors as I hurried toward the exit. John and Carol were already with a couple of deputies outside, perched on a concrete bench in the shade. Carol clutched a folder to her chest like it was the only thing keeping her upright. When she saw me, she stood and wrapped her arms around me without a word, her breath trembling against my shoulder. The deputies gave us a few seconds, then motioned us toward their vehicles. The drive up toward the mountains felt unreal, like looking at someone else's life through a fogged pane. The sun slanted hard through the windshield, turning the dashboard warm under my palms. In the back seat, I could hear Carol's soft breathing, a tight inhale followed by a shaky exhale. A ranger met us at a small station near the edge of the park, a sturdy man with sunburned cheeks and a calm voice. He walked us through the basics, where they had found the car, what time it had been located, what they knew so far. His words were steady, practiced, but I caught the way he kept adjusting the brim of his hat, an unconscious gesture that told me he didn't like the gaps in the story any more than we did. They'd moved her car to a secure area by then, but photos were laid out on a table inside the station. The light above us buzzed faintly, casting a soft hum through the small room. The pictures showed her compact rental sitting neatly in a gravel lot beside the trailhead. No damage, no sign of forced entry. The interior tidy, except for those empty water bottles and snack wrappers, things she'd have tossed at the end of the hike. That neatness made the hair on my arms stand up. It looked too perfectly ordinary, like a snapshot taken before a page goes blank. From there, the search unfolded quickly, almost like the park itself shifted gears as dawn approached. Flashlights bobbed in the half-light radios, flickered with short, clipped messages, and the air smelled of cold pine and dust rising under boots. By sunrise, there were maps spread across truck hoods, places circled in red marker distances measured with a finger pressed along contour lines. Rangers moved with quiet efficiency, their jackets rustling as they gathered ropes and first aid kits. Volunteers arrived in hiking boots still dusted from previous trails, faces drawn with concern and determination. That first morning, the sky was a sharp, clear blue, the air cool enough that my breath fogged faintly when I exhaled. Carol stood beside me at the trailhead, arms wrapped around herself despite the rising warmth. Her eyes followed every ranger, every canine unit moving through the early light. John stayed close to one of the sergeants, listening intently as the man pointed to a printed map tracing the route Rachel had registered for. I stood a little apart, the sounds around me muffled by the roar of my own pulse. The trailhead felt like the mouth of something wide open, inviting but holding secrets deeper in. For hours, the search parties sifted through the forest like combs through tangled hair. The ground was soft from a storm that had passed through the night. Rachel went missing, leaving the smell of wet earth and crushed needles hanging in the air. I followed one of the ranger groups at a distance, the crunch of gravel under our boots punctuated by the occasional bark from a search dog catching a false lead. When the dogs paused, noses lifting, we all paused with them, breaths held. Time seemed to stretch in those moments. But then they'd move on, confused circles widening as scent dissolved into damp air. By midday, the sun bore down through the trees in sharp slivers, warming the backs of our necks and making the shadows look darker by contrast. We reached an overlook where hikers remembered seeing a red-haired woman the day before. The place was peaceful, almost idyllic, a long valley opening beneath us, the wind brushing lightly across the rock. It was here someone said that she'd stopped to take a picture, but no camera was found, no lens cap, no strap, just empty space and a horizon too wide to offer answers. Lead after lead fell apart. A partial footprint near a bend in the trail turned out to match one of the volunteers. A scrap of fabric snagged on a branch was from a child's jacket lost weeks earlier. Even when the dogs barked near a fallen log, hearts jumped only to fall again when they uncovered the remnants of an old picnic site, tin cans rusted and split open from seasons of snow and sun. Late that afternoon, a helicopter arrived, its blades churning up pine scent and dust as it hovered low before pulling away toward the upper ridges. We watched it shrink to a distant flash of white against the mountainside, dipping and circling carefully, the thrum of the rotors fading as it moved further west. Each time it completed a pass and reported nothing, silence settled over us like a cold sheet. I stayed near the command tent, a canvas structure staked into the dirt flaps, billowing slightly in the breeze. Inside a long folding table was covered with maps layered atop one another, corners curling in the heat. A deputy made marks with a felt-tip pen, while another pinned updated search grids to a corkboard. You could smell sunscreen sweat and the metallic tang of hot radios. Over time, the sounds outside blurred intermittent chatter, the crunch of boots, the low murmur of engines from ATVs heading to more remote pockets. People began sharing theories in hushed voices. Some pointed to the storm's sudden, unforgiving imagining she'd sought shelter and gotten turned around. Others mentioned a recent rock slide in a nearby ravine, and for a while a team focused their efforts there, calling down into the shadows and listening for any echo that didn't belong. When nothing came back but the sound of their own voices bouncing against stone, they moved on. But then came the whispers. Locals recalling a hiker missing in those same mountains years earlier, his car found but not him. Students talking about stumbling across an abandoned camp, once old food cans and torn fabric scattered in a circle, though no one ever connected it to anything official. These weren't concrete clues, just stories floating through the pines like old smoke, but in the absence of real answers, even shadows felt worth turning toward. By the second night, the search had widened. I found myself walking the perimeter of the trailhead after dusk, watching the lights of the command post glow warm against the dark. Insects buzzed around the lanterns, strung between poles. The air had cooled, and the smell of sap was stronger, almost sweet. Carol sat near the fire that volunteers had built, her hands clasped knuckles, white eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the glow of the flames. John paced in slow circles, stopping every so often to speak with a ranger, then drifting to the map table again. The atmosphere felt suspended, like holding breath for too long. Everyone was trying to push back the rising dread with movement, with tasks, with checklists and radios. But fatigue seeped in. Volunteers returned to camp with dirt on their pants and sweat darkening their shirts' faces, drawn with the weight of long hours and quiet disappointment. Rangers murmured to each other as they compared notes, their voices low so families wouldn't hear too much. I tried to help where I could, passing out water bottles, helping unload equipment, stepping aside when the trained teams needed the space. But it was impossible not to feel useless. Every time a search party returned, their boots dusty and their shoulders sagging, I felt the world tighten a little more. The light from headlamps bobbing in the darkness began to feel like distant wandering stars guiding people through a sky with no map. On the third morning, I walked out early to the edge of the search zone. The ground was cool under my boots, still damp in places from overnight dew. A soft wind moved through the pines, carrying the smell of the forest floor, earth-old needles, something faintly mineral that reminded me of riverstone. In that quiet, I understood something I hadn't let myself consider. None of us knew what we were looking for anymore. A person, a sign, a scrap, a direction. Anything that could tell a story we hadn't yet heard. Every so often, a radio would crackle with a new report, a noise near the ridge, a possible visual in a thicket, a dog alerting on a fallen log, and each time everyone in camp would still for half a breath listening. Each time the moment dissolved into static. By late afternoon that day, the heat had returned with full force, washing the hills in a shimmering haze. Deputies moved slowly between vehicles, their uniforms darkened with sweat. The command tent felt tighter, more cramped, the maps more crowded with overlapping marker lines. I stood near the entrance, watching as a ranger circled a new area on the map with a red pen. His hand hovered a moment before he pressed the tip to paper. That small hesitation carried more weight than anything he might have said. Then a deputy approached from the far side of the tent. He wasn't running, but his pace was quick, determined, and he held something in his hand, a radio pressed close, his mouth set in a firm line. He murmured something to the search coordinator, who looked up sharply, then turned toward the rest of us. That was the instant the air shifted. Not with answers, not yet, but with the sense that something had been found or nearly found in a place no one had expected. The deputy's voice came over the radio in a clipped whisper, the kind that freezes the air before the words even finish. I was standing near the command tent when it happened, leaning against a folding table covered with maps and half-empty water bottles. A warm wind moved through the pines, brushing dust across the ground in thin, shifting lines. The search had settled into a tired rhythm by then. Footsteps on gravel, low murmurs, the occasional bark from a dog. But that whisper broke the pattern. Heads lifted. Radios crackled to life. One of the supervisors set his pen down so quickly it rolled off the table and clattered against the dirt. I felt the shift before I understood it. Something older than instinct settled heavy in my chest, making it hard to breathe. The rangers nearest the tent began moving with purpose, not rushing, but with the steady, focused urgency of people who know they've crossed from routine into consequence. The smell of warm sap hung in the air as I followed them toward the trees, the forest swallowing the light with every step. The trail narrowed as we approached the slope the deputy had radioed about. A few volunteers had already been pulled back, guided toward the periphery with gentle hands and quiet instructions. The ground here felt different, softer, as if the earth itself had been disturbed recently. I could hear my heartbeat over the crunch of pine needles underfoot, each pulse sharp and insistent. As we reached a break in the brush, a ranger lifted a strip of yellow tape and motioned for us to stay behind it. Below us, down a steep cut in the hillside, the air grew noticeably cooler. Cold drafts drifted up from a shadowed pocket between two rock faces, carrying the damp smell of soil and weathered stone. 3 searchers stood in that hollow, their jackets brushing lightly against the rock as they shifted. One of them crouched near something lodged between the stones, something wrapped, something small. His gloved fingers worked slowly, deliberately, trying not to damage whatever it was. From where I stood, I couldn't make out the details, only the movement of hands and the faint scrape of plastic against rock. Time stretched thin. Even the forest seemed to hold still. A jay screamed somewhere up the ridge, then nothing. Not a breeze, not a leaf, not a footstep. When the ranger straightened up, he held the object close to his chest, cradling it, as though it might crumble. In the gray light filtering through the trees, I could see it more clearly. A bundle of thin plastic layers worn and fused together, edges softened by years of weather. He looked up toward the supervisor near me and gave a small, grave nod. The kind of nod that carries weight no words can soften. I felt my knees weaken. A warm rush surged behind my eyes and my hands went numb. Someone touched my elbow, steadying me, but I barely registered it. The forest had taken on a strange hum, as if the air itself was vibrating not loudly, just enough to let me know that a threshold had been crossed. They carried the bundle up the slope with the care reserved for evidence that can speak for someone who no longer can. The plastic crackled faintly as they set it on a clean tarp laid across a flat stretch of ground. A forensic tech knelt beside it, the zipper of her jacket scraping softly as she bent forward. She peeled back the outer layers with tweezers, the paper-thin plastic lifting in fragile curls. Beneath it was an object that made the breath leave my body in one long, silent exhale. A notebook. Its cover, once stiff, had swollen and warped. The corners had frayed to soft points. But the pages inside, though yellowed and brittle, were intact. The tech opened it just enough to confirm what we all sensed before she even spoke. Handwriting filled the first page. Handwriting I recognized in an instant, even from where I stood several feet away. My legs wanted to move forward, but the deputy held out an arm, gentle but firm. "Let them document it first," he murmured. His voice had that muted, careful quality people use around those who've just taken a blow they can't yet describe. As each page was lifted, a faint scent rose, the smell of old paper and mildew mixed with something metallic from the moisture it had absorbed over the years. The ink, though smudged in places, still carried the rhythm of her hand. I could imagine her sitting somewhere in the woods, rain streaking the margins, fingers shaking slightly as she tried to write through fear. A ranger cleared his throat softly. "We'll take it back to the station," he said. "We'll stabilize it there." But he didn't move. None of them did. For a long moment the team stood around that notebook as though gathered at a graveside. When they finally closed the cover, securing it between 2 thin boards and sliding it into a protective case, something inside me gave way. Not a sound. Not a sob. Just a hollowing and internal collapse as quiet as the shifting of sand underfoot. I'd held on to the faint hope that she'd walked out of those woods and somehow lost her way back to us. But that notebook, it was her voice reaching forward in time, and I knew it would tell us things we'd spent 7 years fearing and trying not to imagine. Back at the station, the evidence room lights were bright and unforgiving. The air smelled of copier toner rubber gloves and the faint aroma of disinfectant. I sat against the far wall while the forensic team carefully separated the pages under magnifying lamps. The clicks of tweezers and soft rustles of parchment-thin paper echoed through the space like distant whispers. As the words emerged slowly, patiently, a picture took shape. She had been alive after leaving the trail. She had been frightened. She had seen something she didn't trust. She'd moved away from the main path, searching for shelter from an incoming storm, only to stumble on a place that felt wrong. A fire pit abandoned but fresh, cans scattered, rags. Signs of someone living out there, staying out of sight. Then the entries shifted, shorter. rushed the handwriting slanted and uneven, lines describing footsteps, silence in the trees, a presence she couldn't explain. She wrote of carving numbers into a tree so someone might find where she'd gone. The last page. The last page was smeared water-stained, as if written in a moment when steady hands were no longer possible. I closed my eyes as the technician read the final lines under her breath, her voice thin with concentration. I can still hear the tremor in her words, even now. When she finished, the room stayed quiet longer than seemed natural. Even the hum of the overhead lights felt subdued. The lead investigator spoke gently. "This confirms she survived the storm," he said. "Confirms she moved into the ravine. Confirms she wasn't alone." He paused, letting the weight of it settle. "But it doesn't tell us everything." Over the next hours, the discovery site was marked, photographed, sealed. Deputies strung fresh tape around the ravine like a pale boundary between past and present. A second team swept the area for additional clues, fragments of cloth tools, anything that might have belonged to a second person. Dogs were brought in, paws crunching softly over the forest floor. They sniffed, circled, paused, then lost whatever faint trail might once have lingered in the soil. Night began to fall as we stood outside the evidence room, the hallway lights flickering against the linoleum. Carol sat on a bench with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze locked somewhere far beyond the walls. John stood beside her, one hand resting on her shoulder, his thumb moving in slow circles, the smallest gesture in a moment, far too large. A captain approached us with a clipboard tucked under his arm. "We'll need statements," he said quietly, "and we'll brief you on next steps." I nodded, though my body felt distant, as if I were moving through a thick fog. The sounds around me, printers, whirring officers, conferring doors opening and closing, all seemed muted and distant. I felt as though I were standing behind my own life, watching it happen from a step removed. When they ushered us into a conference room, the air was cool and still. A single lamp burned in the corner, casting long shadows across the wall. The investigators gathered their notes, preparing for a conversation none of us wanted, but all of us needed. Her notebook sat in a sealed case at the end of the table. And as the door clicked shut behind us, I understood that everything from here on would be about facing what those pages had begun to reveal, and the darker truth they pointed toward. In the hours after the notebook was found, the station felt too bright, too loud, even though everyone spoke in low voices. The overhead lights droned softly, casting a pale glow across the conference table where the evidence case rested like a fragile relic. Deputies moved in and out of the hallway with a rhythm that felt careful, almost reverent. Each time the door opened, a cool draft swept across the room, carrying with it the scent of pine and dust from outside. I sat with my hands clasped, feeling the ridges of my knuckles press into one another, grounding me in a moment that threatened to spin loose. John and Carol barely spoke. She kept her fingers laced tightly together in her lap, occasionally brushing her thumb across the edge of her wedding band, as if the small motion helped her stay present. John sat beside her with his shoulders drawn inward, his breathing controlled and shallow. Every now and then he'd lean forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on a spot on the tile floor like he was trying to steady the entire room with sheer will. The investigators explained what they could. The notebook confirmed that Rachel had been alive for some time after leaving the trail, and that she had encountered something or someone that frightened her enough to carve coordinates into a tree. They acknowledged the hints of a second presence in her words. But beyond that, there were no fresh footprints, no clear signs of a struggle, no path leading away from the ravine. Time had washed nearly everything clean. Even the campsite she described, the one that had unsettled her, was too old, too disjointed, too touched by weather to offer hard evidence of who might have used it. By the next morning, the ravine was sealed off. A series of signs went up, caution tape stretched between trunks, and a small team was assigned to guard the area while federal agents reviewed the case. Helicopter rotors thumped overhead at dawn, stirring needles from the branches and sending them drifting through the cold air like brittle confetti. Volunteers gathered near the trailhead, their faces lined with a mixture of fatigue and hope, though as news spread that the notebook held more questions than answers, that hope thinned into something quieter. Word traveled quickly. Local hikers stopped by the station to offer condolences. A clerk from a nearby store brought a tray of sandwiches no one had the appetite for. A ranger paused beside me outside the station door, brushing a bit of dust from his pant leg before speaking. His voice was soft, almost apologetic, when he said that the forest could hide things longer than anyone liked to admit. The air between us smelled of sun-warmed bark and the faint sharpness of his uniform's fabric cleaner. When the larger investigative agencies stepped in, the atmosphere shifted. A new map was pinned to the wall, marked with grids that reached far beyond where anyone had searched before. They reopened old files involving missing hikers from earlier years, cross-checking similarities. A few older deputies traded quiet looks as rumors resurfaced about a man living rough in those hills years back, about fires spotted deep in the forest where no trail existed. None of the stories were conclusive. Some were based on nothing more than memory and unease. But they kept surfacing, threading themselves through the gaps left by the evidence. Despite weeks of effort, no suspect emerged. No trace of another person, no solid link to any known individual, no definitive explanation for the footsteps Rachel had described. The forest, as wide and wild as it was, offered no more answers. Eventually, the search scaled back. Officers returned to their regular assignments. Volunteers drifted home with heavy footsteps. Even the helicopters, once a constant above the treetops, grew scarce until one day the sky was silent again. Rachel's notebook was preserved, cataloged, and stored as the most important artifact in a case that refused to resolve. Investigators told us they'd keep it open, that they'd revisit leads as they appeared, that they'd continue checking for matches in databases and interviews. But as time passed, those reassurances grew softer, like the fading ring of a bell long after it has been struck. When we returned to Iowa, the air felt different, thicker somehow. The fields stretched out like they always had rows of corn rustling in the breeze. But something in the landscape felt altered. Friends and neighbors brought casseroles and flowers, leaving them on porches with gentle, well-meaning notes. At the grocery store, people spoke in hushed voices, touching our elbows lightly, offering sympathy they didn't have the words for. I remember the way the evening news sounded one night. Calm, familiar voices talking about weather patterns and county fairs, and thinking how strange it was that the world continued its routines while ours had quietly changed shape. Months went by, then years. The case never closed, but it never answered itself either. Investigators believed she had met someone out there. They believed that presence was connected to the unsettled campsite she stumbled into. They believed she'd tried to leave a trail in the only way she could before fear overtook her ability to reason her way out. But belief wasn't enough to name a person or build a case or offer the kind of justice families hope for. Over time, the way we lived shifted in small, subtle ways. Carol kept a lamp on in the entryway long after she and John went to bed each night, as though welcoming a traveler home. John took to walking in the evenings, slow loops around the neighborhood with his hands in his pockets, head bowed. I visited them more often, sitting at their kitchen table with a mug warming my fingertips, the soft clink of dishes filling the gaps when conversation became too fragile. Back in my own home, I found myself lingering over maps more than I used to tracing the contour lines of the Rockies, following the bends of trails she once walked. Every so often, when the house was quiet and the night pressed softly at the windows, I'd take out the photocopy of one of her earlier pages, the one where she described the beginning of her hike. Her handwriting neat and steady, before the fear crept in, always brought me back to that summer, her voice on the phone, the hum of my kitchen fan, the smell of warm grass drifting in from the yard. People sometimes ask how families carry on without answers. I've learned there isn't a simple way. You move through days one at a time. You let some memories in and hold others at a distance. You rebuild routines that feel safe, knowing a part of your life will always sit just slightly apart from everything else, like a room in the house that's kept closed. Even now, when I think of her, my mind drifts to the mountains as much as it does to Iowa, to the sharp scent of pine in the early morning, to the way light filters through branches and falls in thin bands across the forest floor. I picture that notebook in her hands, rain spotting the pages, her breath tight as she tried to leave traces of herself for someone to find. There's a weight to that image I still carry deep and quiet like a stone in a coat pocket. And when the wind blows just right on warm summer days, carrying the faint sound of leaves brushing against one another, I sometimes hear what I imagine she heard, the forest shifting around her alive, indifferent and echoing in ways only the lost can truly understand. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from, and follow the channel so these stories are never forgotten.